guarantee by the end of the session, you are going to be a pro and you will have a clear grounding on how to be a good, faithful advocate. But to start, I want to tell you who we are. So we know some of you, but if you don't know us, my name is LeeAnne Beres. I am the Executive Director of Earth Ministry in Washington, Interfaith Power and Light. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, but I want to let my co-presenters, Jessica and Rabbi Zari, introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Zimmerle, and I am the Program and Outreach Director at Earth Ministry in Washington Interfaith Power and Light. And that means that I have the joy of supporting our congregations most directly in greening their community life, and then also engaging in faithful advocacy and managing the variety of campaigns that we work on across the region. And I would love to welcome Rabbi Zari, and if you'd like to introduce yourself next.
So I'm Rabbi Zari Weiss, and I am a rabbi here in the Seattle area, and kind of have just recently transitioned to out of doing congregational work to entering into this next chapter of my life, which includes writing and hopefully a lot of political and social action, particularly on climate issues, because that's something that I have long been passionate about.
Fabulous. Thank you both so much. Before we actually start the program, I do want to just acknowledge that Jessica and Rabbi Zari and I are all coming to you from Seattle, Washington, which is the unceded territory of the Duwamish tribe. And so we take a moment at the beginning of every presentation to give land acknowledgement to both honor the people of the land, the Duwamish tribe, but also the land itself. It's an important way to honor Indigenous histories and to make sure that both history in the past and the history we're making right now are acknowledged. So if you are not from the Seattle area and would like to know what kind of Indigenous land you are on, Jessica is going to drop a link into the chat that will allow you to enter your address or your city or your state and to find out whose land you are currently on. And that works for anywhere as well. You can do that for where you were born or where your historical family is from. It's just a really great, useful tool. Want to tell you just a little bit about Earth Ministry and Washington Interfaith Power and Light. I know some of you are quite familiar with us, but if you're not, we are a multi-faith organization that seeks to transform faith into action for the well-being of communities and the environment. So we engage congregations in working on environmental stewardship in their congregations, but then we also work on systemic issues and provide strategic guidance for faith communities that are looking to engage on environmental justice. And so if you would like to know more about us, our website is on the bottom of this page. It's just earthministry.org, and we welcome you to get involved both as an individual and through your house of worship. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Jessica to start us off with just a little backgrounding on what faithful advocacy is. And then we will immediately launch into how we can be faithful advocates together. All right, so Jessica, I turn it to you.
Thanks, LeeAnne, and welcome to those who are joining us. We've had a few more trickle in. We are glad you are here for this conversation about faithful advocacy and joining us on your Sunday afternoon. Like LeeAnne said, I'm going to begin with just some basics to give us a foundation of advocacy overall. So to start, let's just talk about what is advocacy. In general, advocacy can be thought of as speaking up to influence decisions, and that can happen within political, economic, social institutions. It's working on the level of systemic changes. So we are not focused as much on direct services or charity, but more digging deeper into root causes of issues and advocating for reform that can lead to policy shifts that address these deep roots. And we like to say that advocacy is really democracy in action. And here we practice advocacy all year long at Earth Ministry WAIPL. So we joke, working out isn't something you can do once every 4 years and call it good. So similarly, advocacy is not, just voting once every 4 years and calling it good, but rather it's practicing our democratic muscles, working them, flexing them throughout in various different settings, and doing that year long. Next slide, please, LeeAnne. So then here we are as people of faith approaching this topic of advocacy, and that does change the dynamic a fair amount. And our focus today is really on leaning into this faithful component of what our advocacy looks like, because it really does bring a different weight into the conversation. So with that then, what is faithful advocacy? We can talk about it as speaking up for systemic justice in a way that is deeply rooted in our religious values and spiritual traditions. And in doing that, we have a sort of guide map for what our faith says is a just and loving society, and how we have a role to play in co-creating such a world that has been made by our Creator and entrusted to our care. So we really value faith in action here at Earth Ministry, and that is why we invest a lot of our time and energy in faithful advocacy as an avenue through which we live out our various faith traditions. Next, please. So digging a little deeper into attributes of faithful advocacy. So these are different points that kind of differentiate it from perhaps a secular approach. We, as faithful advocates, really want to hone in on our values and get specific in naming why it is we care and shaping stories that share those values and really paint a vibrant picture around humanizing these policy issues that can be rather heady, instead bringing them into the heart. And with that, we're often bringing in our values with justice and equity at the core, really wanting to uplift love for the neighbor, speaking up alongside the most vulnerable, and working for a more just world, as we see painted in scriptures. And then finally, I think a really important piece is hope. So approaching advocacy through faith comes with an inherent sense of hope, of this concept that we aren't to complete the work, but start it and do our piece. And with that, we can kind of breathe a sigh of relief, know that there's something bigger at work, and that all of the tools that we need have been gifted by God throughout our community and world. We can just help bring our piece of that puzzle to the table. So that's a bit about our values-based approach. From these values, we bring a gift of building bridges. So in our advocacy, we've seen that the faith community can really hold space for dialogue in rather challenging situations, because we're moving past the kind of partisan divide of hard-headed stances and the facts and the fact checking and questioning one another, and instead saying, hey, what do we have common ground on in our values? How can we ensure that we're not going to leave anybody behind? We want to really see the full humanity of all sides of a conversation and find a path forward together that's collaborative. A lot of our work in this area right now has to do with salmon recovery and conversations around the lower Snake River, which if you're familiar with Washington State, can be a challenging conversation, especially in the eastern region of our state, but Earth Ministry has played a really central role in bridge building, in having conversations with Native leaders and farmers and fishermen, and having faith leaders, clergy people being brokers to mediate those spaces. And then finally, the last attribute I pulled out here is that faithful advocacy is supported by community. So you are not the lone ranger in this effort as a faithful advocate. You are supported by your community on many different levels. It might be folks at your individual congregation. It might be people within the Earth Ministry network. It might be people broadly within your tradition. But when you show up and say, here I am here as a member of Temple de Hirsch Sinai, that amplifies your message in knowing that your community, the people that you gather with to worship weekly, have a shared values base, right? You can't speak for them. You can't say everybody at my congregation thinks exactly the same as I do, but you do gather around values. And so it is a shared entry point that amplifies your voice. And also, I would like to say sustains it. So, you have your community to help hold the spaces where you need to lament and process the need for our advocacy, and then also come together and help bolster your shared work together, help encourage one another, and kind of share the workload, so to say. So we all show up when our gifts pull us in different ways, and that together is rather a strong unifying factor. Okay, next slide, please, LeeAnne. Okay, so I did want to touch on a bit about why. So we talked about these attributes, but on a kind of more pragmatic base, why really show up as a faithful advocate. So it's always important to remember that our decision makers, our elected officials, work for you. And in order to best represent you, they need to hear from you. That is really important, and just building those relationships can help them better reflect your values in the policy spaces they are working in. Plus, when they hear from you, they can capture some of the stories that you're sharing. I have heard from state legislators directly how beneficial it is to have stories that they can bring onto the floor when a bill comes up for a vote. Because that way they can say, I have a constituent who told me that she's a working mom and a teacher and really is hearing her kids in 3rd grade expressing their fear about climate change. Right? We need to take action for these children. I can teach them everything about science, but that isn't going to solve the future that we are passing on. So those stories are ultimately what a decision maker might think about at the end of the night when their head hits the pillow. It's those heartstrings that are tugged on way more than any numbers or data that has been put on their desk. One of my favorite points to make is that only 7 contacts can create a shift in a decision maker's stance on an issue. So this is approximate, it's not a magic number, but this means approximately 7 emails, phone calls, conversations, and meetings are especially influential from constituents are enough to make a decision maker pause and say, maybe I need to look more into this. It's not going to get them from a no to a yes. So this is an incremental shift, but if they're not even looking at this issue, it can get it on their radar. If they're kind of neutral on it, it can bring them toward a stance on one way or the other. And even if you think, oh, I don't need to bother, they're already going to vote yes on what I would like them to do, still really important to contact them because those contexts can boost it from just a yes to championing the conversation and bringing it across the aisle and spreading more passion around it because they're hearing from you. I love this visual of a moral anchor. So when we show up as faithful advocates, again, bringing our values, we can provide that anchoring that can really ground a conversation around an issue. Again, you're going to hear this over and over, out of the head into the heart, right? That can really make it more challenging to argue like the, I don't know, financial implications, right? Right now, Earth Ministry is advocating for a bill that codifies environmental justice in state law. It's gonna have a budget line, right? But when it shows up in its fiscal committee, we are gonna show up loud and say, hey, yeah, we have a moral obligation to have a systemic response that brings health equity issues to the forefront of how we respond to environmental pollution. Faithful advocacy, we like to say we take kind of a both and approach, so it can complement individual actions. So we don't want to minimize the good work that you are doing in your personal life, in your life together as a family, as a faith community. Your individual actions do make a difference in the big picture. And we also need to speak up for systemic change. We can switch out light bulbs all day long, and that is good work, and that will lower our carbon footprint. But ultimately, we need to change the grid that those light bulbs are screwed into, right? So it's a both and to how we act out our faith, individually and systemically. And then the last point here is just really thinking of advocacy more and more as central to an active life of faith. Right? It's not something that is supplementary or above and beyond, but across the board, spiritual traditions call us to create a better world for all. So this is a central component of faith and how you walk through the world as a person of faith. So I think with that, I am done with my section, but before we move along to hearing from Rabbi Zari with some more Jewish perspectives on faithful advocacy, I would love to just pause in case we have any questions about this first section that lays our groundwork before we move forward. And you can also put questions in the chat if you prefer. We got it, right? Okay, if questions pop up, do put them in the chat. Okay, here's a question. Do you have a group in California? So, great question. So Earth Ministry is based in Washington State. We are part of a national network called Interfaith Power and Light. And there are over 40 states that have organizations similar to ours that are part of this network. So there is a California Interfaith Power and Light. I would encourage you to get connected there. And if you're here in Washington, we are your go-to organization for this work. And trust me, we will be sharing ways that you can get involved as we move along here. So don't worry about that. You will get plugged in with our community and we will be sending you action opportunities on the regular. Okay, so with that, I will step back and invite Rabbi Zari to share some of your insights into a Jewish approach to faithful advocacy.
Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciated your presentation. I feel like I learned some really valuable things. So I wanted to begin just with an acknowledgement of the perspective from which I speak about this topic, and that is as a person of faith. And what I mean by that is that my understanding of the world and my place in it is based on a fundamental belief in the oneness of all. So we often speak about that oneness in conjunction with the word God or the divine. But to be honest, I actually feel that the word God or the divine, that those words can be distracting for some people. And I think for some people in our modern world, actually alienating. And so I would rather preface the word oneness with the word, my kind of theological word of choice, which is the mystery or the great mystery. And so this is some of you who are familiar with Jewish tradition might recognize this statement. We often refer to it by its first word and call it the Shema, but it's actually it's a verse from the book of Deuteronomy, and it is actually it's not a prayer, it's an affirmation. And I like to translate these words in my own particular way. So Shema, listen, Yisrael, you God wrestler, because that's what the word Yisrael really means. And then this 4-letter name, which is kind of a placeholder for that great mystery that we often refer to as God. But again, I like to use the translation, the great mystery. So but in Hebrew, we often say Adonai, which literally means my Lord. Again, it's kind of a placeholder for a concept that we don't even know how to name. So the great mystery is our God, or I might say what we embrace. The great mystery is Echad, which can be translated as one, or I like to translate it as the oneness of all. And not only the oneness of all, but the oneness of all that is, was, and ever will be. So there is an idea that this oneness that pervades all existence in this universe has a kind of eternality to it. And so this is such a fundamental belief in Judaism, this idea, this belief in the oneness of all. And I feel like these 6 words are so profound and have such important implications for us as we face the reality of our changing climate and the impact that our changing climate is having on our environment, on our planet, and on our very existence in the universe. Because I believe that when we affirm the oneness of all, we remind ourselves and each other. So it's a call, Shema, listen, listen you. And we're saying it to others and we're saying it to ourselves too. Listen you. We are a part of a greater whole. And because we're not only interdependent with everything, but we are also, in the words of psychologist Miriam Greenspan, intervulnerable. So LeeAnne, if you could advance the slide. So, we often talk about how we're interdependent, but I just learned this concept that she shared fairly recently, that we are also intervulnerable, which means that we recognize that what takes place somewhere on the other side of the planet affects us wherever we are, here in Seattle or maybe in LA, wherever you are, and that what takes place where we are affects those on the other side of the planet as well. So not only are we interdependent, but we are intervulnerable. And because we are both interdependent and intervulnerable, then we have a responsibility to do everything that we can to care for all the different parts of creation on this planet and in our universe. So the birds, the forests, the seas, even the smallest animals that can't speak for themselves. So it's as from a Jewish point of view, a Jewish perspective, it's my responsibility to speak for them, to do what I can to protect them, their well-being, and their continued existence, just as it is my responsibility to care for myself and those that I love here. So that leads me to the subject of advocacy, speaking up and speaking out and working to bring about that kind of systemic change that Jessica talked about, that are necessary for the health and the well-being of our planet and all of the people and all of the creatures and even the inanimate objects that are a part of this world. So I'd like to just highlight a few very basic values or teachings that underlie Judaism's tradition regarding advocacy. And the first one is actually based on a verse from the book of Leviticus, the third book of the Torah. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha velo tisa alav chet. So hocheach tochiach means you shall surely rebuke or reprove. Et amitecha, your kinsperson, the one who lives amongst you, who is a part of your people. Velo tisa alav, but don't bring upon yourself chet, a sin in doing so. So I feel like this is such a powerful teaching within Jewish tradition, within the part of the Old Testament, for those of you who are Christian, that it tells us that we have to be a social critic when we see that society or individuals are making terrible mistakes. And so when we see that our country is relying too much on fossil fuels to provide energy, as an example, or when we see that our nation is not participating or cooperating with other countries that are strategizing about how best to work together to address the issues around climate disruption and environmental degradation, then we have an obligation to speak out, to advocate that we rejoin the Paris Accords, etc. So I feel like this is a really important underlying principle within Judaism for why we need to become passionate advocates. The next one that I want to highlight is the importance of not remaining silent in the face of injustice. And so, within Judaism, we always try to base things in our text. We're a very textually oriented tradition. So here we have a passage, a teaching from the Talmud. It was related that Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Yochanan and Rav Haviva taught the statement cited below. And I cut out a little bit of it. They said, anyone who had the capability to effectively protest the wrongful conduct of the members of his or her or their household and did not protest, he or she or they are apprehended for the wrongdoings of the members of his or her or their household and punished. And if that person's in a position to protest the wrongful conduct of the people of that person's town and fails to do so, that person is, maybe better than apprehended, held accountable for the wrongful conduct of the people of their town. And finally, if the person is in a position to protest the wrongful conduct of the whole world and fails to do so, that person is held accountable for the wrongful conduct of the whole world. So I feel like this is also such a really important underlying principle that we cannot just sit back and do nothing. We have to act. Rabbi Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel said, in a democracy, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Some are guilty, but all of us share in the responsibility. And he also said the opposite of good is not evil. The opposite of good is indifference. And so it really reminds us that, again, we can't just not do anything. It doesn't mean we have to do everything. It's as I can't remember whether it was LeeAnne or Jessica said at the beginning, there's another beautiful teaching. It's not upon you to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. It may be beyond our capacity to solve the climate issue, but at the same time, we can't not work on it. We have to do something when we see that people are doing things that ultimately are going to be wrong for our our environment, our planet, our universe's well-being. We have to do something. And so that leads me then to just kind of more specific guidance regarding Judaism around our environment. So just shared a few things about advocacy, but so much of Jewish tradition speaks to our responsibility to care for the earth and all that's a part of it. And we have the beautiful story of the Garden of Eden, and there's a controversy in that, in some of the language that's used, because in one place it says that human beings are supposed to conquer and subdue it, and in another place it suggests that human beings are supposed to be the caretakers of it. So it was that idea of the conquering and subduing it that led a lot of people to think, oh, well, the environment or the natural resources are just there for us to be able to mine and to exploit for our own good. But there's really another way of understanding that. And I just want to quote Ellen Bernstein, who's one of the founders of, she was the founder of Shomrei Adamah, which was the very first Jewish national environmental organization. She reminded us that our role is to tend the metaphorical garden, to guard it and to keep it, not to exploit it. Our responsibility is to pass the garden of this earth on as a sacred trust, so that all of the creatures and everything that exists can continue on l'dor v'dor, from generation to generation. And so there's this beautiful midrash that I have often referred to and taught from when talking about, basic Jewish views on the environment. And I want to read this, but I want to point out that I think that part of it's accurate and part of it's not. So when the Holy One first created the world, the Holy One led Adam, the first human creature, around the trees in the Garden of Eden. God said, "See my works, how beautiful and praiseworthy they are. Everything I have created has been created for your sake. Think of this and do not corrupt or destroy my world, for if you corrupt it, there will be no one to set it right after you." So, I've taught this text many times, but I actually really feel that the first part reflects a kind of what I would call anthropocentrism, kind of believing that human beings are, in a sense, the pinnacle of creation, higher than all other forms of life that exist. And so from the ancient rabbis' perspective, the whole world was created for the sake of human beings. And that was the worldview of the rabbis in their day. And I want to say, thankfully, we've come a long way. And I think that we, as I said earlier, we now see how we're all interconnected and intervulnerable. So if the rainforests in the Amazon are destroyed or the salmon stocks are depleted, the ecological havoc will reverberate throughout the world and will impact all life forms. So we have to recognize that we are all interconnected and it's not all created for our sake to exploit. But I think the ancient rabbis actually got something really right, and that is this last part of the teaching. If we corrupt or we damage this world, there will be no one to set it right after us. It's in our hands to undo the damage that has already been done, to speak out and up for all the parts of creation that can't speak out and up for themselves. The trees are our responsibility, the frogs, the bees, they're all our responsibility to protect them as well as our own human lives. And so with this kind of underpinning of faith that guides me, and for each one of us drawing on our own faith traditions, we know that we have to put our faith into action and translate that faith in the real world into our actions in the real world. And this is now where LeeAnne is going to take us to see how we can actually bring our faithful action into bringing about change and helping to protect our world.
Great, thank you, Rabbi Zari. Before we move on though, does anybody have questions for Rabbi Zari? That was a really helpful grounding in Jewish thought and tradition around both advocacy in general, but advocacy for the earth in specific. So I want to make sure that if folks have questions, we can take those now before we move on.
Or comments or arguments, those are allowed too.
Exactly. Some comments in the chat.
Rabbi Zari.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi Zari. I was really touched by those 3 quotes that you quoted, one about in a democracy, one about the opposite of evil, I think it is, and one about it's not on you to complete the task. Can you say again who was the source of those comments?
I will put those in the chat too, so you can actually have copies of them. The first
Wonderful.
one I can
Thanks.
easily do because I have it right here, but the second one I'll have to type out. So it was Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a great rabbi of the 20th century, who was a great fighter for justice. And so the first one was a kind of taken from a couple of different places from his teachings. And then the second one is actually rabbinic. It's a rabbinic teaching from Pirkei Avot, which the ethics of our ancestors. And I'll type this one in. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. It is not upon you to complete the task, but neither are you free to desist from it. So that was written by the rabbis 2,000 years ago. And for me, I just want to say that that actually goes back to what Jessica said about being hopeful, because there's a recognition in that there are things we're not going to be able to complete in our lifetime. And, rather than feeling hopeless about that, there's a kind of humility that we do what we can in the time that we have and know that it's helping to make this a better world.
Thank you.
Great. So let us move on for now. As Rabbi Zari said, we as people of faith are called to put our faith into action in the real world. And I'm going to hearken you back to probably 10th grade civics, just to give us a little background on where we can actually put that faith into action for public policy. So give me 2 minutes to just refresh our memories that there are 3 branches of government and 3 levels of government. And so in the branches of government, we have the legislative branch, which at the different levels can include things like the city and county council at the very local level, our state legislatures, and for the federal government, Congress. In the executive level, these are things like the mayor and county executive at the local level, our governor and lieutenant governor, and then obviously at the federal level, the president and the vice president. And the same thing is true for the judiciary. We've got the local courts, the state courts, and the federal courts. Our advocacy is primarily focused on the legislative and executive branches. The legislative branch is the one that passes laws. So you think about, local ordinances, county executives passing ordinances at the county level. We've got the state legislature passing bills that affect the health and well-being of communities and the environment. These are all things that we're pretty familiar with and understand that we as citizens have the ability to make our voice heard in those forums. The executive is the lesser known, but still very important branch, because this is where laws are implemented. So if you stop and think about once say, for example, Congress passes a law focused on environmental protection, it has to be implemented by a federal agency, which could be, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency. And so there are regulatory hearings and opportunities to be making our voices heard at these levels as well. And so as we move forward and talk about faithful advocacy, just kind of keep these two different opportunities in line in your mind. We can work to pass good laws, and then we can make sure that those good laws are implemented in ways that we intend and want to see. One of the questions we get pretty often is, oh, I've heard that, my house of worship cannot engage in any kind of advocacy whatsoever because that is illegal since we're a nonprofit. And I just want to take a minute to explain the difference between partisan politics, which is prohibited by all nonprofits, including congregations and nonprofits like Earth Ministry that are 501c3. You might have heard that before. And if not, no worries. It's just a type of nonprofit that is a tax exempt entity. We cannot do partisan politics. So that means that your synagogue cannot endorse a candidate, cannot encourage people to vote for a particular candidate, and no one associated with a house of worship can use that community's time or resources to work on a political candidate campaign. And that includes using, say, for example, a synagogue's email address, right? So, because that's up the property of the house of worship. So those are things that are absolutely prohibited if you are a tax exempt nonprofit like a house of worship. However, we can and should participate in nonprofit advocacy. And the difference is, rather than focusing on a candidate for office, this is taking a position on an issue, a bill, or a ballot measure. So a bill in front of the city council or legislation in front of the state legislature that will affect the health of our communities. Absolutely. We have not only the right, but the responsibility to speak up and take action on those issues. We can educate others, asking them to take action. We can contact other elected officials and ask them to vote a particular way on a bill. Again, on the executive side, we can request an agency take a particular action, like making sure that a permit is approved or denied for an environmental project that would have impacts on our local community. We can engage in nonpartisan voter engagement. So that means things like turning people out to vote. You can do a get out to vote campaign as a house of worship as long as it is absolutely nonpartisan and you go door to door, and whether they're Democrat or Republican, independent, not registered, you treat everyone the same. Same thing with the candidate forum. I know lots of houses of worship that have hosted informational forums on transportation issues or energy issues. That is great. You have to invite all of the candidates running for the office that you are targeting, and you have to treat them all impartially. You can't lob softballs at your preferred candidates and give very difficult questions to the ones you're not supporting. So it has to be completely impartial throughout. And so as long as you keep those boundaries, we again have the right and responsibility to speak up on key issues that matter to us as individuals and also to us as communities of faith. So what does faithful advocacy actually look like? So it means a lot of different things. It starts with meeting with elected officials. And we always encourage people to build relationships with their elected officials. As Jessica said, they're people just like us. They work for us. They want to get to know their constituents. And so the first time you contact them, they won't know who you are, but if you introduce yourself and you continue to be in touch with them regularly, but not obsessively, and also, treat them with respect and dignity, they're going to want to get to know you, and they will become people who will listen to you and see you as a leader in your community. We want to encourage you to contact folks directly, but also work through a faith-based organization. And, Earth Ministry can provide you with opportunities to meet with your elected official. If you are meeting with them in person, and we'll get into a little bit this more later, you have the opportunity to either talk with the elected official directly or meet with their staff. And I know a lot of people sometimes get disappointed and say, oh, well, I only am meeting with somebody's legislative assistant, not the member themselves. And do not be distressed by that, because oftentimes the legislative assistant or legislative director is going to be the person who knows even more about the issue, because that's their particular portfolio of issues. And so they can really hear and understand and listen to what you're saying and take it back to the state legislature or the member of Congress in a way that is going to be more in depth and informed than if you only had 5 minutes with the member of Congress yourself. So meeting with elected officials can look like a lot of different things, but just know that whether you're meeting with them or an aide, they really do want to hear from you. Same thing with emailing. This is where you have a chance to share who you are and share your story. And we're going to really dive into that. Jessica's going to walk us through a small group exercise for you to help craft your own story to share. And emailing is where you have more time to really put that forward in a thought out, clear way to make the point that you want to make in your meetings.
Are you going to interrupt your piece?
Here in Washington State, we have a Washington State Legislative Hotline. Many states have it. There's also a Capitol switchboard for the federal government. And so if you want to leave a message for your elected officials, you can do that by calling a hotline number and leaving a voicemail for your electeds on a particular issue. And then one of my favorites is going in person, especially down to a state legislature, and participating in a literature drop or lobby day. And a lit drop is simply going with an organization of folks, and we take teams of people of faith down to Olympia here in Washington, where we have a fact sheet on a particular bill. And we literally go from office to office, leaving that fact sheet, literature, dropping it at each office, saying why we support a particular bill and why the faith community cares. So that is a lit drop. And a lobby day is, again, going with the group of people of the same, persuasion, again, and people of faith for us to do a bunch of meetings with legislators at the state capitol. And that's just really empowering and a lot of fun. Faithful advocacy also has to do with hearings. And this is a great photo of a hearing. It was the Energy and Environment Committee. And you can attend a hearing and show up in person to show your support, or sign in. Like right now, we're doing an entirely online virtual session here in Washington State. You can sign in online in favor or against a bill from the privacy of your own home and still be present to show your support and register your opinion without ever having to speak. So it's a great way to make your voice heard, but not have to actually prepare a testimony. But we do encourage you to prepare a testimony, because that is extremely powerful. And so we help at Earth Ministry, we help people of faith prepare testimony for public hearings. That usually is about 2 minutes, so it's not particularly long, but it's really important to get your key points in. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that later. But being able to make your voice heard in a clear and cogent way in a short amount of time is really powerful when you're testifying at a hearing. The last two things: participating in public comment periods. You can send emails, send postcards, sign petitions that are part of public comment periods on legislation or regulatory hearings. And then last but not least, speaking up at town halls. Many of us know that we get emails from our elected officials where it says, my representative is having a town hall. You can show up, you can listen, you can ask questions, you can let your elected officials know what issues are important to you outside of an actual legislative hearing. So they're still structured, but they're a little bit more informal than testimony, for example, in front of a committee like the one we're looking at here. So those are some of the examples of what faithful advocacy looks like. And I'm going to turn it back to Jessica now to talk a little bit more about how you can tell your story. Before we do that, though, I want to again emphasize that it's important to do this work in community, right? So we are the faith community. We have a unique voice. We have strength in community together. And so it always is much more effective to do this work in partnership with your local faith-based, interfaith, or multi-faith organization, either focused solely on the environment or on a multitude of issues. And as we said in the beginning, if you're in Washington State, your organization is us. We're Earth Ministry, Washington Interfaith Power and Light, and Jessica's dropping that link in the chat. But if you aren't in Washington and want to get connected to an interfaith group near you, we do encourage you to join with one of our partners in the Interfaith Power and Light Network. And Jessica's going to drop that link into the chat. So if you want to look up your community, someone already asked how do they get connected in California, that would be California Interfaith Power and Light. But there are IPL affiliates in nearly 40 states, and we work very closely in a national network to help you have the tools and the opportunities to put your faith into action. Okay, and just put that link in the chat so you can look up your state if you are not here in Washington. And with that, I will turn it over to Jess to walk us through a great little exercise to help you craft your own story.
LeeAnne, can I just make one little distinction? Jessica, is that okay?
Yes.
That might be helpful. And maybe you could say something to this, that there's a really important distinction between speaking from our faith and having our faith guide us versus wanting a law to embody that faith, which we don't want, because that would be a violation of separation of church and state, right? So yeah, so I think it's really powerful for any of us to be able to come to, approach a legislative representative or a, city council or whatever it might be, to say, my faith guides me to say this and to help to create a world that reflects this, versus I want this to be encapsulated in a faithful way in the legislation itself.
That's a really good point, Rabbi Zari. Thank you for raising that, because what we're trying to do is understand that, at our core, many of us want the same things, right? As people of faith, we're guided by our values, which, for many of us could include stewardship, justice, collaboration, community. Those are not uniquely religious values either. There are things that, many of us want to see a better future for our children. But we are speaking from our own community and what undergirds our rationale for caring. But the pieces that we're looking to see codified in legislation or in public policy are secular values, and we're not asking for religious interpretations of laws or religious pieces of laws. We're just speaking from a moral perspective. So that's a really good distinction. Thank you. Other questions or other thoughts that y'all might have before we move on? All right, well then, Jessica, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, LeeAnne. And can I ask actually to pause on the slideshow for a minute so I can share screen? Oh, hi, everybody. It's good to see you. Okay, so what I want to do before we get into these specifics is, I realized in our presentation we're kind of in deep, and I want to pull us out a little bit to think about different issue areas for advocacy before we start to practice. So what I'm going to do is a quick screen share of Earth Ministry's website, which I'm extra excited to share with you because we just launched a new version of it this week. So this is hot off the digital press. This is earthministry.org and our section on faithful advocacy. So what I want to draw us to is the variety of campaigns that Earth Ministry is currently engaged on. So our advocacy work ranges through these different areas of environmental issues. So we've talked a lot today about legislation on the state level, on the national level. Right now, we are in the state legislative session, which is all sorts of fun. So there are lots of current actions you can take. I've saw some questions in the chat about what can we do right now. This is our legislative action page. You can click through, like here's a link where you can click right here to sign in pro for a bill that's going to be heard this week in the Washington State Legislature. So for those of you in Washington, I encourage you to explore this page on our website, which we'll get in the chat for you, and click through for some current actions. But I also just want to touch on our other ongoing advocacy, which shows up in different ways, kind of more administrative advocacy. So we work on halting fossil fuel facilities. Often this work is in partnership with Native nations because sadly, it is often their land and waters that are most directly at risk from build out of fossil fuel infrastructure. We are also working with tribes around salmon and orca recovery. I mentioned we do a lot of this work in the eastern portion of our state here, but of course it crosses our mountains here just as the salmon do to touch all parts of our state identity and well-being. And we do some work around environmental health and toxic chemicals. The class of chemicals we are currently looking at are PFAS, which are non-stick chemicals. And then finally, we of course want to help create climate justice. So that is an area that overlaps with much of our work. Fossil fuel are directly tied to climate justice as we want a fossil fuel free future, but then also doing some more intentional work around like a Green New Deal, both locally and nationally. So this just kind of provides you the big picture of issue areas to get your imagination maybe flowing, because we are now going to go back to our PowerPoint and do an exercise practicing talking about these issues and what could be turned into an email to a decision maker, or how you even just talk to a friend about it after you are done with this workshop. Before I forget, I'm dropping our legislative priorities website into the chat, so you can open that and explore it later. Also, if you're here in Washington, I will be teaching in more detail on our state legislative climate priorities as part of the Interfaith Advocacy Day coming up on February 11th. So I can see you there. I think Cinda, you were saying, what can I do? So that is a great place to show up. Okay, so when we're talking about framing our story, we can break it down into three main questions. Who are you? What do you value? And what do you want? Now let's dive into each of those a little bit. Who are you can encompass both your personal identity, your faith identity, and your communal identity. So the personal piece, we know we are all multifaceted humans. What I encourage is you pull out a piece of your identity that really aligns with this subject that you're speaking up on. So if you're talking about salmon recovery and you love to fish, you're a recreational fisher person, maybe bring that forward. You can also bring something like, I'm a human who breathes air, or I'm a human who has asthma. If you're talking about something that's really related to air quality. If you're really concerned about toxics, you might want to bring forward that you want to be a mother someday, or you are a mother or a grandmother, etc. Your faith identity, again, like I said before, it kind of brings the multitude of voices behind you at your back, and also that same with your communal identity. So Earth Ministry has some brand recognition here in this part of our nation. So if you show up somewhere and say, I'm a member of Earth Ministry, that holds some influence in knowing that, okay, they're connected to this network, they're legit, we trust Earth Ministry, Okay, what are they going to say? So first, who you are. Then, what do you value, and how is that connected to your lived experience? So earlier I shared the example of a teacher. What if we said that that was even, the third grade teacher at a congregation, right? So you're like, oh yeah, I teach faith formation to the littles, Sunday school, whatnot, or at Shabbat. So sharing that experience of teaching to those kids and saying, I have a value on a better future for all generations to come, right? And so we have this responsibility. We have a call to legacy that is livable and healthy for these little ones. And because of that, I'm really valuing clean air, clean water, seeing that importance. So I ask you to fill in the blank. So bringing in your story there and the values around it. I also had a clergy person recently talk about how when they were young, they always said, oh, we're going to do it better, right? And now here we are kind of in the same situation, if not worse. So in that case, it was interesting. They were bringing in a value of progress, of learning from our mistakes and continuing to grow. And so that's another example. So they said, so now here I am, I have this vivid memory of the first Earth Day and recalling us saying, we'll do better. And now here we are, and I'm calling you to do better, Tacoma City Council. Here's what I'd like you to do. And that's where you get to the, what do you want? So first, we want to paint a big picture of what is the future we want to see. We want to see a future in which all creation is thriving. There's healthy communities, clean air, clean water, right? Abundance for all. Paint that picture a little bit and then say, to help us get there, here's what I'm specifically asking you to do. So speak directly to the decision maker and say, so please, to help bring about this future in which climate justice is really embodied across our state, I need you to vote yes on Senate Bill 5141 and to move it out of committee today, because we don't have time to waste. So that big picture gets them like, yeah, I want that too. The specific ask is like, okay, that's actually what you can do. And it makes it easier for them to say, yeah, because I do want that big picture. Oftentimes too in testimony, I'll share, it makes sense to share that specific piece also up front. So you might want to frame your testimony if you're actually showing up to testify in front of at a hearing or whatnot. Say, hi, I'm here in support of Senate Bill number, then share your story, then end again with that specific ask. So it's really clear what you are there in support or opposition of. So we've been talking a lot. Now is your chance to get to practice this a little bit. So we are going to use the breakout room feature and encourage you to stick with us through this, because advocacy is something that really becomes easier and easier each time you practice the words coming out of your mouth. So we are going to invite you to go into a pair and talk to one other person here and just practice this 3-part storytelling framework of who you are, what do you value, and what do you want. You could apply it to whatever environmental issue really strikes your heart. That's why I wanted to show the variety. So, maybe it's salmon and orcas or some species conservation issue. Maybe it's really climate justice and the impact on the vulnerable. Maybe it's the toxic chemical issue and what we're putting in our bodies without knowing. So you can pick a issue area and just speak to it. And if you don't have the specific ask right now, that's okay. We're just practicing. I see a couple folks don't have speakers or can't participate right now. So that's okay. We're just going to do a short breakout. So when we come back, we will debrief a little bit and so you can hear about how it was. So let me just pull up.
Yes, if you want to leave me in the main room with the folks who can't do the breakouts, I'd be happy to stay.
Okay. Let me pull this up, and I'm gonna get Lisa and Aura in the same room. So you can both just hang out here in the main, or reject the invitation and hang out here in the main room.
And we do encourage you to stick with us. Like I said, this is not going to be very long, and there'll be some examples on the other side of it that I think will be helpful,
Yes.
even if you can't participate in the breakouts themselves.
Okay, so here we go. You should have an invitation up to accept into a breakout room.
All right. Hi, Lisa, thanks for sticking with us.
Broadcasting the.
Yep, great.
Oh, thanks for looking
So
at our
actually-
legislative priorities, Lisa. Yeah, good idea.
Great. Actually, Jess, since we're here with Lisa and Aura, even though they can't participate, should we model this for them so they can?
Sure, LeeAnne, I'll be the decision maker. I've used up all my creative ideas so far.
All right, well, see, I just put myself on the spot. Lisa and Aura, you're getting unvarnished on the spot, sharing your story. So this is a true story. Again, my name is LeeAnne Beres. I'm a member of a faith community here in Washington State and also with the organization Earth Ministry. And I want to tell you the story of my uncle. My uncle and aunt, my aunt is Puerto Rican, and they lived in Puerto Rico for almost the entire 50 years of their marriage until 2015, when Hurricane Maria hit. And my uncle was a diabetic, and so they actually evacuated out of Puerto Rico 2 days before the hurricane and moved to my cousin's house in Colorado, because as a diabetic, they expected the power to go out, and my uncle's insulin would not have been refrigerated, which, if you know anything about diabetes, is pretty severe, and they were afraid that he would not be able to take his medicine. Making a long story very short, my uncle ended up passing away 6 months later in Denver from complications from diabetes without ever having the ability to go back home. And my aunt is still there and has never been able to go back home. And it's easy to say, you know, climate change doesn't cause that particular hurricane or that particular hurricane, but it's clear from the science that our changing climate is making more and stronger and worse hurricanes on a regular basis. And so even though, you know, we can't draw that clear line, we can still say that Hurricane Maria was part of the universe of natural disasters that climate change is causing, which means that my own family are now climate refugees. And so I care very deeply about climate change, and I want to see our state take real action to make sure that this doesn't happen to other people around our country and our state, but also around the world. Because as a person of faith, I care very deeply about communities and the health of people as much as the planet. And so I'm asking you, Senator so-and-so, to support the clean fuels bill in front of your committee right now. It's one of Earth Ministry's priority pieces of legislation. It's going to ensure that our energy system and our fleet in Washington State is using clean fuels, not dirty fossil fuels, and that will help slow carbon emissions here in our state. So I'm asking you to be a champion and to pass this bill out of committee. And to ensure that we can halt the spread of climate change and prevent other people from going through the tragedy that my aunt and uncle have gone through. Thank you for your support. Boom. So that's one example of how to tell a story. I probably spent a little bit too much time giving you the backstory on that. So giving myself some feedback, I would shorten that piece up a little bit. But it's hard when it's something that, you know, is powerful and emotional. It doesn't have to be that deep though. You know, like people, you don't have to say, oh, well, I can't give a testimony because I don't have that kind of, you know, background. It can be anything. It can be, you know, you have, you care about the health of your child that is, you know, putting their face on carpet treated with this PFAS chemical, which causes endocrine disruption. You don't actually have to have problems with your child, but you can say like, I don't want that to happen. I don't want that to happen to anybody's child, right? So it can be any kind of story that connects with that piece. And I just saw your note, Lisa, that you were a lobbyist in DC for years. So you're an old hat at this. You should be teaching us how to do this. If you were a lobbyist in DC, then you definitely know how to speak to members of Congress. That is the highest level of being able to tell your story. Anything you want to add, Jess? Well, we're glad you're here, Lisa, and climate related issues are, you know, unfortunately touch all aspects of society.
Yeah. No, LeeAnne, I think that was good. I think it kind of shows, you know, so if you were going to go share that with the Senate Environment Committee, you would probably want to practice and then figure out what to cut down, knowing that your heart was going to be in it, right? So practicing always important and helpful, or jotting out your testimony. And the feedback I would point out is pulling in a bit more faith components to tie in with your story. I think in the example you provided, we could say something like, you know, often we think about climate refugees as being folks in other countries across the world. And that's something that faith communities are especially concerned about. And more we're seeing it here in our own country. And we need to address that and show up to help folks, especially, yeah, I mean, Puerto Rico not being treated as our own country is its own problem. I could go on a rant on, but
yeah, I completely and totally accept that feedback. Like I said, I hadn't planned on doing this impromptu story sharing. So, I saw your chat, Aura. Exactly. You know, things about saying is something as simple that you no longer see the multitudes of dead bugs on the windshield you used to see as a child. That, you know, our changing climate is changing species, and more are shifting geographies, or, you know, unfortunately going extinct. So that's a really valid point.
Yeah, and I think that that's a good example because it's so relatable. Like everybody who's ridden in a car on the highway knows what it's like after you go on a road trip and you got to clean off that windshield, right? And thinking like, oh yeah, maybe it has been less here lately. So it's a good relatable example. And I think you could also then bring in faith. One of our Jewish partners shared an example of thinking about how like our impact on species extinction is in a way undoing Genesis, right? Like, whoa, if you drop that in alongside this observation, that's a really powerful testimony. I forgot to give our breakout participants a heads up, but we will be welcoming them back now. The rooms are closing. So we can come back and share a bit.
Excellent.
Oh, and we have a new friend in the waiting room.
Yep. right. Everyone back?
I think we're waiting on a couple. One room, 2 rooms still chatting. They have, I think, 60 seconds, so it'll come back soon.
Oh, and there's our conference minister.
Okay. I think that we have folks back from our breakout rooms. Thank you. So we would love, and actually, LeeAnne, if you want to stop screen sharing, we can do a gallery view. Hello. So we would love to just take a few minutes to hear what that experience was like for you. How was it practicing the storytelling aspect and working within that 3-question framework?
Well, I'll go. I thought it was incredibly helpful to practice saying this out loud. Like you mentioned, I'd written a testimonial to submit on a bill, but then saying it to someone helped me really clarify what was important to me and make sure that I was really moving through the specific points. And I want to thank Rabbi Zari for telling me a story that pulled at my heartstrings. It worked.
It also helped me to know what I need to know in order to do this. Like just doing it off the cuff and not being prepared, I kind of made it up, but it helped me to know specifically what I needed to identify so that I could do it more with greater articulation.
Yeah, and I appreciate that point, Rabbi, because I think a lot of times I observe people being hesitant, saying, I don't know enough. Right. So I noticed you said it made me think about what I need to know, and notice that didn't include a Google about the stats on climate change and carbon dioxide emissions per capita in Washington State. Right. What you needed to know was that heart story, and that's what is going to stick with Victoria moving forward. And again, we can trust that our partners in the secular environmental movement are going to show up with those facts and figures, the policy, the economics, all of that, the science, it will be covered. But what you need to know is your story that you bring. So great point. Would anyone else like to share about how it was practicing with your partner? Yeah.
I'm a newbie to this work, and I had an idea that I shared with my partner, Phyllis, who is a veteran of this kind of advocacy. And not only did she encourage me by validating my idea, but she also stretched it to include some other possibilities that I hadn't thought of to make it stronger. And so both of those things, the affirmation and the expansion, were really helpful to me. Thank you, Phyllis.
How was it for you bringing your values into the conversation? Did that feel natural to you, or is it something that you felt like you needed to give more thought to? What was that like?
Is that question to me or to the group?
To anybody, but if you'd like to answer it, go for it, Sabrina.
Okay. I guess I'm still kind of thinking about how to express my faith publicly. I'm a Christian, and it feels so politicized to say that, especially in a political arena, and I'm sensitive to that. So I think I might, just, I have to think about how to word it in a way that makes me feel comfortable, but that also, expresses my values. So I'm going to spend some more time on that.
Great. Yeah, and you are not alone in that discomfort. I hear it often, and I think it's it's a bit countercultural for us to show up faith forward, especially if you're in Washington State, where they call us the none zone, because there are so many people that check none when it comes to faith tradition. So there can be a lot of assumptions that you might feel like are being placed on you. But the more we speak up, the more people know, oh, okay, this is what the Jewish community is talking about, climate change and justice. Wow, okay, this is what the Christian community is talking about. That's not what I've heard in media. So it also helps shift that overall narrative a little bit every time we show up. The other piece
I'd like to talk.
Oh, go ahead, Phyllis.
So I was the partner, and her story was a value story from her profession, which I think is equally as valid and not as defensive by saying, I come from a faith tradition and this is how I feel, but hers was relating to her professional identity and trying to help kids. And I think, that's something that you can feel proud of and not feel defensive about. And I'd like to add one thing that I've learned from this conference, is that the representatives who have always been hearing from evangelical climate deniers constantly, but they have not been hearing from people of other faiths or people of even the same faith who are not a climate denier. So they're thinking that many, many religious people are climate deniers because of the scripture verses that they keep getting from the climate deniers. And I have heard through this conference that it's up to all faiths to step forward and say, I as a Christian, I as a Jew, I as a Buddhist, I as a Muslim believe this, so that the representatives and people and the senators are going to start hearing there's more than one religious view. And I keep hearing it's our moral obligation to be doing that.
Phyllis,
Yeah.
thank you. That is exactly it. And that's part of why we are so glad to be part of the Jewish Climate Festival and part of the National Interfaith Power and Light Network, because that is exactly what we are trying to do, is to show that the faith community, the multi-faith community, is deeper and broader and stronger, and slowly, hopefully faster, becoming more vocal and making it clear that these are values that we all share and want to work forward together. So I share your enthusiasm for this festival. I think it's been really inspiring and empowering for all of us. So that's a really great point.
Just makes me curious. Is there the possibility of a kind of parallel type of festival within the Christian world or the Muslim world, or is there any thought of that or efforts toward that?
Well, Interfaith Power and Light, we do partner as a national network to do a Faith Climate Week, which is around Earth Day in April every year. That's, I think, 5 or maybe even 8 years old now. So that is something similar. It's not the exact same format as this, but it's providing resources and ideas for congregations to host their own events, which is, oftentimes problematic for some, but empowering for others. But there are other similar things, but not quite exactly like the power of this incredible festival.
Yeah, the festival organizers really did an excellent job of adapting to our virtual world. So it will be exciting to see more online events with community broader than physical, geographical, from across our nation. So something that we can now explore more as organizers, since we've all adjusted to using Zoom technology. I do know we're coming up to our time here. So I did want to just wrap up this practice session and let you know I'm always happy to be a resource. If there's some question you have that comes up later on, don't hesitate to be in touch. I will put my email here in the chat. There are so many ways that Earth Ministry would love to stay in touch with you and make it easy for you to put your faith in action through advocacy. Since you registered for this event, you should be hearing from us. We will send a follow-up. And we also had a few other events. We hosted 3 other events as part of the Jewish Climate Festival, and they are all recorded. So some of those get more in depth into current advocacy campaigns. There's one on the Tacoma fracked gas facility and how we are standing with the Puyallup tribe in resistance to that. And then another on a really important bill in our state legislature called the HEAL Act. That was an event in partnership with Temple de Hirsch Sinai. So those recordings will be up on our YouTube and website within the coming week, and we will send them around as resources that you can also explore. So we appreciate your time. I'll wing it back to LeeAnne to close us out and send us on our way.
Yeah, we just want to say thank you for spending your Sunday afternoon with us. I know that there has been a lot of wonderful content in this festival. I also know that we're at the tail end of it. And I don't know about you, but my brain is full, but in a very good way. And my heart is also full. So yes, thank you, Sarah. Exactly. Thank you. Yes. And thank you for your time, your attention. We look forward to working in partnership with all of you and are just grateful to be on this path as we walk into faithful advocacy together. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good.
Be well, everybody.
Stay healthy.